Here we are. Amanda Reeves, down in Melbourne, sunny Melbourne, where it's nice and dry and warm right now. It's really nice to be with you. Thank you for giving me your time. Um, Little bit of an introduction. Amanda and I got to know one another probably 4 or 5 years ago or something like that. It was around COVID-y sort of time. And then we've had a few coffees and I visited her in her lovely little bunker of a studio in sort of North Melbourne near Lygon Street and everything. And so we've talked futures. She does a lot of experiential sort of work with futures. She was, and maybe you still are, using Lego. I thought that was terrific. Amanda's working in multiple jobs, and I'm going to let her tell us those rather than me trying to throw them at you. Amanda, because it's also a good context for, what's your futures world? Because it's a very broad world. You're not just a futurist, you're multiple things. So tell us a little bit about yourself, please, Amanda.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me, Marcus.
No worries.
So I have a variety of different things that I do. Some people politely refer to it as a portfolio career. I refer to it as whatever is interesting to me at the time. So it's a bit of a bricolage approach. So I run my own consultancy, which is called Wabi Sabi Futures, where I work with different organizations around either upskilling them in foresight, helping them to learn tools and bring that in, or to support them in doing work, particular projects I might be doing. I also am an educator. I'm currently working with UTS, University of Technology in Sydney. I help teach a subject called Envisioning Futures Worth Wanting, which has undergraduates from all different streams, and we get them to collaborate and learn about futures by doing it. I'm working with Monash Business School, where I've written and now teach a number of different subjects that are incorporating futures into how they're teaching business there, and really rethinking is the way we do business, have done business historically, the way we want to
Yeah,
continue doing that.
yeah.
And I also do a bit of work with the Australian Public Service Academy. I teach a variety of different programs around how to lead change in a government context.
That's fantastic. So sounds like you're a bit busy.
I am a bit busy. I do like saying yes to things.
Yeah, well, I think it's important because that keeps you new context for new thinking is one way to put it, I guess. And you
Yes.
you told me on the side just before that you're studying. What are you studying?
Yeah, so I'm just in entering my final year of study to become an arts therapist. And that might seem like it doesn't have a lot of connections to futures work, but I found that there is actually quite a strong connection. Both of these are looking at, both fields are really interested in emergence. They're
Yeah,
both interested in noticing patterns and exploring how could we change patterns or make patterns
yeah,
different.
yeah.
How do we really notice what's happening and tune into different signals that are around us? Yeah, it's a really interesting complement, I think.
So I think that's lovely. So you've got all of these things going on, and that's rich and it's diverse. And I
Mm.
think that what often makes for a rich life too, in my mind at least, which of course explains my ADHD approach to everything.
Well, look, if
Now,
you do work that's not interesting and you're not growing it, then that's not for me.
yeah, absolutely. Well, let's wind the clock back. That's what I was
Yes.
going to say. How did you get into futures? When and how? What happened?
I went on a date, and it didn't lead to a second date, but it did lead me to enrolling at university on a whim. Uh, so at the time, I was working in government. I was working at the Victorian Department of Health, and we were doing some work around workforce planning and trying to figure out how many different doctors, nurses, different allied health specialists we'd need to support
Yeah,
people in Victoria in 10 years' time, and working our way back to figure out how many people do we need to make sure there's placements for to be training today. And as we were doing this work, we talked about some of the big things around, we've got aging populations, what that means for our workforce and what that means for healthcare. We were looking at the really big trends that everyone knew about and were very visible and we were experiencing then. But this would have been, I think it would have been about oh, 2015. It's been 10 years, my God. And at the time, I was noticing all this other stuff. There was talk about, self-driving cars was really big. We were talking about CRISPR, gene editing technologies. I was getting really curious about, well, what does that mean? What does moving to self-driving cars mean for organ transplants? We were doing some cool stuff with 3D printing in the medical field.
Yeah.
And I just saw all of these little things that weren't quite there yet, but I was wondering, well, how do we think about those changes we're seeing at the periphery? And because they might be really important in what's happening today. So I was reading books. I went on a date and
With a futurist?
with a futurist, someone who was in the program. Yes.
How cool.
So I'd been reading Black Swan, and I mentioned that, and they were like, "Oh, cool, we've been talking about that in class." I'm like, "Tell me about this class." So just based on the back of that, I enrolled, and what I thought was going to happen was I'd get very good at understanding trends, at being able to know things. I thought I'd go in and get really certain, and actually the opposite happened.
Uncertain, yes, exactly.
Yes. And I'm so glad that actually I had the experience I did and not necessarily the one that I thought I was in for.
Yeah, yeah. What a great story. And it's recommend dating futurists is something that most people should do at some point.
Absolutely.
All right. So you're obviously working in it and you found your own style in it, which is very clear to me.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why when I heard you were doing Lego and stuff, I was very interested in the experiential stuff. So, of course, in some respects, that explains why you're still in it. But why are you still working in this field?
So it's an interesting time to be talking about this because I'm preparing to step more into my arts therapy practice from next year.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've learned about this work is that whether or not you're explicitly doing futures work, it gives you a different way of thinking, a different way of questioning, a different way of sort of noticing what's happening and making sense of things that are shifting around you and things that are shifting within you as well. Like, I was really surprised by how much we ended up talking about, well, different value systems and what does it mean and how do people make sense of what they're seeing outside and what do they anticipate. And so I feel like from now on, even if I said, even if I was working in a very different field, I'm still going to be bringing that work with me because it just provides such a rich way of understanding very complex things.
Yeah. Okay. So given all of that, essentially what I hear is you're describing that there's a futures consciousness can sit behind all the tricks, all the methods and tools and everything. So there's a futures consciousness there. Could you talk a little bit more about that before we move on, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think probably the easiest way to talk about that is to think about, yes, I thought I was coming in and I would get very certain I would be able to know things. Yeah. And what the reframing that's happened for me is that I'm getting very good at saying, well, that depends. And I can tell you about what are some of the different things that might be influencing something. I can look at trends and I can also see counter trends. It's not just what's happening, what the big movement is. We're seeing for example, we're seeing a lot of movement towards generative AI at the moment. But I'm also noticing people who are making a conscious decision to say, actually, no, like I have concerns about this and I'm pulling away. And how do I actually step out of that? I think there's this real critical and reflexive part that comes with studying futures. And yes, the tools and the frameworks are really useful for engaging with others, but they also really shape the way that I think about what's happening.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of like a hammer is only as good as the context and the carpenter or the genius with it, what can we do with a hammer? Of course, so futures triangle, futures triangle, it's just a trick. But no, if you've got that deeper futures consciousness to go with it, you then add, it becomes like a 3D futures triangle. There's a prism of possibilities. Yeah.
Yes, and it's almost like internalizing some of those frameworks that it starts to become just that part of how you think, not a thing you do.
Yeah, nice. So in getting into futures, so you kind of jumped in boots and all by the sounds of it. You did the course and all that sort of stuff.
I
What
did.
about obstacles to getting into this way of thinking, but also as a business, because you run your business. So
Yeah.
there are different ones. Of course, as an educator, there are different kinds of obstacles too. So
Yes.
can you? You don't have to give me a shopping list of them, but talk about some of the obstacles that you've encountered, please.
So I think probably the biggest obstacle, well, it's a bit surface level, but the biggest obstacle is helping other people understand what it is you do. I'm also one of the, just to add to the list, I'm also one of the co-hosts on FuturePod, which is a podcast where we talk to people in the
I
field.
forgot about that.
Yes,
FuturePod, good old Future, and
FuturePod.
FuturePod X too, which I
Yes,
was on. I was on that the other day.
you were. It was fabulous.
Mhm.
I'm the voice of the future correspondent, which is a
Of
fun.
course you are. Now I hear your voice.
Yes.
Mary, that's right.
And one of the things I love about being on FuturePod is that we ask people how to explain what they do to when they're talking to someone who doesn't necessarily understand what we mean when we're saying futures or foresight.
Yeah.
And every person has their own answer to that question. Sometimes those answers are very dependent on who they're talking to. Sometimes it changes day to day. I think the biggest challenge, and I think it's getting easier, there is a growing awareness of the field, and I feel like I have to explain it a little bit less these days, but
Mm.
yeah, really being able to articulate what this practice is and what it means to in a way that an audience can sort of grok that or find a connection with, like, oh, that makes
Yeah.
sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, if you think, well, as I'm thinking about what you're saying, the future for most people is out there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they might worry about it, they might strategize, what's my financial plan, for retirement or whatever it might be, thinking in those kind of very practical ways. But the
Yes.
assumption is it's that it's out there. So
Yes.
futures studies, well, one is, and futures have been saying this for decades, well, how do you study something that hasn't happened yet?
Yes.
Or all of that kind of stuff. Do you use an example? Is that one way that you might communicate what it is that you do?
Yeah. So I guess one of my standard ways is that I work with people to help them notice what's shifting around them as well as what's shifting internally. So in an organization, like how are things changing for them? How are things changing in the context that they're in? How do they make sense of that?
Yeah.
What do they feel is a useful direction? Because anytime we're talking about, moving in the right direction, well, that's very subjective. What
What is the
what
right
is better?
direction?
What is the
Yeah.
right direction? So working around that, and then also thinking about, well, what if anything will we do about it?
Mm.
I
Yeah.
also sometimes talk about agency and hope being really important parts of the work, that it's about
Nice.
helping people understand how they can contribute to creating a future that is worth wanting, or how they can find pathways towards futures, particularly when in situations where things might be a little bit grim. If we think about things like climate change, how can we, you know, work with what we've got, start where we are, and find pathways forward.
Mm. Do you think, still pursuing this obstacle question a bit,
Mm.
do you think people's fear of the future is an obstacle? Have you encountered that? This is a totally off
Mm.
left of field for me. I just popped into my head then.
I like those questions. I don't know that it's necessarily fear of the future that I've noticed as an obstacle. I'd say it's more fear of their own power and control. So I think sometimes doing futures work makes people recognize how many
Yep.
things are actually outside of their control, and that can be really uncomfortable, particularly if they feel the need to be really certain.
Mm.
Um, Also, sometimes people are just looking for an answer or one direction, and we've
Okay,
got a
which is
very
where
good habit
you,
of saying, well, it depends.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So you're teaching, you're practicing,
Mhm.
you're also opening up new avenues where you're going to combine, I guess, pursue that Lego type stuff into art therapy, where it's very tactile and so on.
Yes.
Do you think you've cracked being a futurist? Is there a cracked point? Do you reckon? I don't know. It's a tough question, I think.
It is a tough question, and I guess it depends on how I see having cracked something. I'd say I've cracked it in the sense that I feel comfortable enough in the space and I feel like I've got enough tools in my belt that
Hmm.
I feel comfortable in most spaces around doing futures work.
Yeah.
But one of the things I really like is it's a very broad field. There's lots of different areas you can look
Yep.
into. I learned under Dr. Joe Voros, who loved to talk about, we start with the entire sum of human knowledge, and then we can decide where we're going to focus. So
Yeah.
that really broad range of things that we can be looking at means that it's always interesting. So I
Yeah.
feel like there's that sense of, even if you feel like you've cracked it, there's always more to learn and always more interesting things to look into. And that, I think, is a sweet spot for me.
Yeah, nice. I would say something the same, though I didn't study under Joe. But I mean, the point
Mm.
is that there is never that kind of, just because you might have a certificate in this or that. It's just part of the pathway. You look over your shoulder and you can see those things having happened.
Yes.
One of the things that I admire about, let's say, Sohail and Ayatollah's work, particularly, is that he relies heavily on case studies.
Yes.
So, do you, in your work, let's say
Mhm.
teaching that hope for, what's it called?
Envisioning futures worth wanting.
Yes, worth wanting, yeah, aspirational futures, in other words.
Yeah.
Do you use case studies in your own pedagogy? I might call it that, in your own
Mm.
communication with students.
Yeah, sometimes we look at case studies and we look at examples. So in that subject, there's definitely an aspect of doing some experiential futures work. So we show
Hmm.
them some work by Stuart Candy, we show them some work
Yeah,
from Superflux,
yeah,
and we try and give these examples that are really exciting and enlivening, and really help you
mm,
have a connection and like a
mhm,
real strong response to what you're seeing about that
yeah,
future.
great,
Yeah.
lovely. Only one more question, Amanda. Really, what would you advise people? What is your advice to people thinking of entering this field?
My advice would be to go in, and as you do, really try and open yourself to the experience. There will be things that you aren't expecting. There might be, if you like me are going in expecting that you'll come out with all the answers, maybe check if you'd be comfortable if you come out feeling
Yeah.
like you have less answers, because that can be part of the experience. There can also be quite a lot of, we had quite a range of emotions. I remember when I was studying in this space,
Mm,
there was grief about different things. There was real excitement. There was, yeah, it can, I'd really suggest to just open yourself up to the experience and see and notice how you respond to things, and use
yeah,
those noticings as a guide.
yeah, beautiful. So yeah, I think for me, what summing up what you said, it's about personal growth. That there's something.
Yeah,
The future is very personal, and there is
it's
an
very personal.
intimacy to futures. It's physical. How's my body aging? But it's
Hmm.
also mental. It's aesthetic. It's relational. It's deeply relational.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we take that idea that the future actually doesn't exist yet, that it's not out there waiting for us and already predetermined, when we are talking about the future, a lot of it is about we're projecting ourselves and what
Mm.
we expect and what we think and how we understand things forward. And so, yeah, if you're going in thinking it's just going to be looking at what's happening outside, be prepared to look inside just as much.
Look inside just as much, at least. Well, I'm going to stop you there and say thank you so much. It's really nice to connect again. It's been too long
It
between
has.
Amandas. I like it very much. When I come down to Melbourne next, I will look you up and we can have a date.
I'd love that. Yes, and
Okay.
and if any students happen to be popping through Melbourne or you'd like to reach out,
Yeah.
please feel free to reach out and say hi.
There are a couple of students that I think are in Melbourne or nearby. So, yeah, that's good. So,
Fabulous.
thank you, Amanda, and we'll end here.
Thanks, Marcus.